Good afternoon. My name is Joanna Chase, and I am the Senior Chair of the Gerontological Society of America's Emerging Scholars and Professionals Organization, also known as ESPO, Webinar Task Force. Evan Pliss, the Junior Chair, and I would like to welcome you to the third webinar in ESPO's Professional Development Webinar Series. The title of this webinar is Show Me the Money, Grant Writing for Emerging Scholars and Professionals. I'd like to introduce our speakers, Laura Raffield and Dr. Ruth Masterson Creber. Laura Raffield is a PhD candidate in Molecular Genetics and Genomics at Wake Forest School of Medicine and a recipient of an F31 Predoctoral Fellowship from the National Institute on Aging. Dr. Ruth Masterson Creber is a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and the School of Nursing. She was a recipient of an F31 Predoctoral Fellowship from the National Institute of Nursing Research, as well as a recipient of grants from the John A. Hartford Foundation and the Edna G. Kynett Memorial Foundation. There will be time for questions towards the end of the presentation. You may type your questions via your control panel in the question box area. You can also contribute today via our Twitter webinar hashtag, which is hashtag #ShowMeTheMoney, also found at the bottom of each of our slides. Please feel free to ask questions on Twitter and share your thoughts live. Thank you to our speakers today, and thank you to our audience for their attendance.
Well, Laura and I want to thank you for being willing to join us today. So before we begin, I want to have full disclosure that Laura and I are not experts in grant writing. We are your peers, and we're going through this early career process of writing grants together. So we hope this webinar is going to be a great opportunity really for us to learn together. So we're going to share some tips and topics for you, and then we hope that we will learn from you in the question and answer time. So we're really framing this conversation today as a journey towards getting grant funding. And that journey begins with the idea, and then it moves to choosing the right institution, putting together the team, writing and submitting the grant, and finally, hopefully, successfully getting it funded. So these are the different steps that we're going to be going through today. There is one key element of a grant that I want us to keep in mind throughout this presentation. Grant writing is really an exercise in effective communication. And that means that it's our job as a grant writer to be as clear and logical and simple as possible, both for people who are experts in our field as well as people who are reviewers but maybe not experts exactly in our field. We also, and another way of keeping it simple is dropping as much jargon as possible. We also need to keep in mind the review criteria throughout the grant writing process. So from start to finish, we need to be thinking about these 5 topics. Oftentimes we can get so caught up in the research strategy that we focus all of our efforts there, forgetting that we're also being evaluated on us as a candidate, our career development plan, our team, including our mentors and co-mentors, as well as the environment and the institution that's supporting our training grant. In addition to keeping this review criteria in mind, we also need to keep in mind how we're being scored. So this is specifically the NIH scoring criteria, but other foundations have similar ones. And basically, all of these organizations are looking for impact and looking for high impact. So NIH uses this 9-point scale, which lower is better, clearly. And the reviewers, all the reviewers on the study section give each of the grants an overall impact score, with 5 being average. And then the specific reviewers who of our grant, they will give us criterion scores as well. So we're rated, evaluated 1 to 9 on those 5 review criteria that I just showed. Now sometimes grants get not discussed, and that means that in that round they were considered a little bit less competitive, so they don't get a numerical impact score or the individual criterion scores. So once again, the most important thing that all funding agencies are looking for is research that's going to have significance and impact. And NIH defines high impact as the likelihood of a project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on the research field. So for us as grant writers, that means that we really need to keep the question of, does this research address an important problem at the forefront of our minds, as from choosing the idea to writing the grant. So one helpful tool for kind of getting a lay of the landscape for other people who may be doing research in the area is this NIH tool. This is in Reporter, and the specific tool is called Matchmaker. And it's useful because what you can do is take, and I just did this recently. I'm in the process of writing a K award right now. And I was able to take a draft of my specific aims, paste it into the Matchmaker, and it actually, as shown here, it gives best matches in terms of institutes, specific activity codes, as in an R01, R21, a K, as well as the specific study sections that they suggest for your topic. So I also found this useful because it enabled me to see other specific PIs who have gotten funded by these specific institutes who may be doing similar, asking similar questions, but in different patient populations, or using a similar tool, but once again with a different group. So I think this is a really useful tool for us to keep in mind, especially as we're in the beginning, trying to get that idea together. It gives us a lay of the land. Okay, now we move on to the specific aims, which is the hardest and yet the most important part of the proposal. I kind of like to think about it as a sandwich, and if a sandwich, why not an ice cream sandwich, right? Where we start by setting up the problem and the question we want to solve in that first paragraph. And then we move into the action, and that's really the aims, and pose how we want to solve that problem. And then finally, in the last paragraph, we provide some resolution by discussing the outcome or results we expect, as well as where this is going to take us next. Specific aims pages can also be really enhanced by some simple figures. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Okay, specific aims are so important to get widespread feedback on. This is a real opportunity to reach out, get that support from colleagues, mentors, other people in your department, because the specific aims need to be approachable and understandable by, once again, someone who's an expert in your field, as well as a layperson, as well as someone who is an expert in another field. So just getting that broad feedback on the clarity and the conciseness of the specific aims is very useful. Now, it can also be a helpful tool for building the team. Especially if you're going to a new institution, being able to, and you're interested in potentially collaborating with someone, being able to send them your specific aims and tell them that you're working on this grant, and seeing if they may want to be part of that is useful. Then the other thing is that program officers from specific institutes really like us to reach out early to them. And when we reach out, when I've reached out in the past, they always say, send me your specific aims page, and we'll have a meeting to discuss whether or not we think this is a good fit with the institution and the institutional priorities. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so now let's talk about building the team. This is an essential part of the grant, and one of those 5 specific criteria that we're getting evaluated on. So the team really consists and can consist of mentors, co-mentors, consultants, and collaborators. NIH specifically is looking for a primary mentor who has a history of both funding and mentoring, successfully mentoring other students. And they really, really prefer that the mentor is currently funded. But that doesn't mean that you can't have other people that may not be currently funded on the grant, because many of those people may be able to provide great expertise as a co-mentor, and other people may have the time that you need to for that training period. And so it's really important to really think through the different aspects of the team, what you need in terms of logistic, scientific, and then financial support. So when you put this robust team together, they also really expect that you have a very clear plan for how the team is going to meet and collaborate together. So I usually use a table and show who I'm going to be meeting with weekly, who I'm meeting with monthly, who I'm having teleconferences with, and then they really like for the team to meet together at some points. And that could be teleconferences, or it could be face-to-face in person at GSA or other national conferences. So just keep that in mind. So in terms of the timeline, the recommendation is just to start early. The exact timeline really depends on the mechanism that you're looking at. And as you can see, the F mechanism versus the K, they have different deadlines in terms of when you can be applying for them. But the other thing to keep in mind is that it takes longer to write these grants, especially if you've just switched institutions. For instance, if you finished your doctoral work and you're now starting a postdoc. Getting that team together and getting people on board, it really takes a substantial amount of time. So start this process early. The other thing to bear in mind is that with many of these applications, early career applications included, is that they often need to be resubmitted. They get scored, but not scored competitively, and that's the need of resubmission. And in order to allow for the time needed for resubmission, you really need a good 18 months to allow for the process of submitting it, getting it reviewed, having it go to council, and then maybe needing to resubmit. So keep that 18 months in mind. So start early and plan ahead.
Hi everyone, this is Laura. So I'm going to start out by talking to you a little bit more about sources of grant funding. So Ruth and I have been focusing today mostly on NIH grants, and that's a big place where people apply for early career mechanisms. But there are definitely a lot of other opportunities available. So the figure that I have here is just showing some of the NIH early career mechanisms for individuals who either already have or are in the process of earning a research doctorate. So at the predoctoral level, that's going to include F31 fellowships, and at the postdoctoral level, that includes F32 fellowships. However, there are many, many sources of funding other than the NIH that you should definitely look into to see if that might be a better fit for you. And just some examples that I thought might be relevant to GSA members that do provide either predoctoral or postdoctoral fellowship awards are the American Federation for Aging Research, the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, and the American Diabetes Association. There are a lot of other institutions that also provide these, so I would definitely recommend checking the advocacy and fundraising groups that are relevant to the health topic that you're studying. There's also often different mechanisms for individuals with a research doctorate versus individuals with a medical or health professions degree, so that's another thing that you'll need to look into depending on what your situation is. This link that I have listed here is from the Fogarty International Center at the NIH. That center focuses on global health, but they've put together a really nice extensive list of non-NIH funding opportunities, both for predoctoral and postdoctoral students. So that's something I would recommend checking out. And there's many other institutions that have lists online, including the National Postdoctoral Association and schools like Harvard and UC Berkeley. So those would be good places to check out to also look for non-NIH sources of funding. So before I talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of these NIH fellowships, I'd like to start out by giving everyone a little bit more motivation to apply for these grant mechanisms. NIH is really investing a lot of money in training mechanisms and early career grants, as you can see here by the total funding. This is the combined total for all the agencies funding each of these grant types, including F31s, which I said are a predoctoral fellowship, F32s, which are postdoctoral fellowships, and then K Awards, which are also going to be after you've earned your doctorate. And as you can see, the success rates are all over 20% for these mechanisms, which compares really favorably to recent years, the success rate for R01 grants or some of the other grant types offered by NIH. And I've listed a link here where if you're interested, you can also look up agency-specific funding rates and funding rates for different years online. But they tend to be over 20% pretty much every year, at least in the past. So I think it's definitely something that's worth applying for if you think this might be a good fit for you. So now I'm going to sort of specifically go through some of the parts of an NIH fellowship grant. My focus here is on F31 and F32 mechanisms, but the sections are really similar for a lot of the other early career awards, such as K Awards, which Ruth will talk a little bit more about. So the research strategy section is often the section that people focus on the most, and that's definitely really important. This is where you're going to describe your research questions and what your plan is for how to answer those questions. Obviously, the quality of your research and the fact that you're using up-to-date methods, things like that, that's going to be really key. But the utility for training is also very important. The reviewers are going to want to see how the research that you're proposing in this section is different from your prior work and what you're going to be learning during the training period. You do want to include preliminary data in this research strategy section, but that's mainly to demonstrate feasibility. The requirements are really not as stringent as they would be, for an example, an R01 grant. So don't let a lack of extensive preliminary data exclude or discourage you from applying, because it definitely doesn't have to be as extensive as you might think. It's very key, though, when you're doing this research strategy to discuss any potential pitfalls and how you're going to work around those. We all know from our research experiences that things don't always go the way you plan, and there's often things that you thought were going to work that really turn out to be a bust. If that happens, what are you going to do? The reviewers are going to want to see that you have a plan for how your research training can still be successful. You also don't want to be too ambitious for the time period proposed for the training. So you're not going to solve every problem in your entire field of study during a 3-year training program. So keep that in mind and be realistic about what you should be proposing here. And it's definitely important to relate your research strategy to the broader goals of the agency. Again, making sure they're a good fit even before you start is obviously a great idea. And you also want to relate how your research strategy fits with the goal of improving human health. Another really important section is the sponsor and co-sponsor information and training plan. One thing that's important to consider is either your sponsor and or your co-sponsors, if you have chosen to include a co-sponsor in the application. Both of those individuals' mentoring experience of individuals at your specific career stage is going to be considered. So the reviewers are really going to want to see that your sponsor, or at least your co-sponsor, has some experience successfully mentoring people at your career stage, whether that's predoctoral or postdoctoral, and that those individuals have gone on to successful careers in research. So that's something you need to keep in mind right from the beginning. It's also really important that this training plan and sponsor and co-sponsor information fit in really well with the rest of your application package. So you want to make sure, for example, what you're describing in the training fits with the career goals section that you're also going to have to fill out, and also with your personal statement narrative that you're going to include in your Biosketch. Make sure your training is addressing the issues that you bring up in those other sections. It's also really important to think about training as having multiple dimensions. I think the thing a lot of people think of first for the training plan section is coursework, and that's definitely appropriate to be included in both predoctoral and postdoctoral applications. But there's a lot of other things that you could include as well. And that would include, for example, attending workshops or presenting and attending professional meetings, also attending seminars both in your department and in other related departments. All of those things can be components of training, and you should definitely include them here. You also want to talk about how you're going to be trained in skills, including leadership skills, technical and bioinformatics skills, manuscript and grant writing, and working collaboratively in multidisciplinary teams. You're not always going to be attending a formal training for these type of skills, but they're going to want to see a discussion of how your sponsor and co-sponsor are going to help train you in having these skills, which are really necessary for a successful research career. The training plan also needs to include some ideas for how the sponsor and co-sponsor are going to help the applicant transition to independence. and how the training fits in with your long-term goals, which you can be explicit about what those goals are. For example, let's say you're submitting an F32 postdoctoral award. After that award, would you plan to submit maybe a K award or your first R01? And if so, how is this training going to help you reach that goal? So we obviously don't have time to go over every single section in these fellowship awards, but one other section that I think is important to think about is the Biosketch. Both you, your sponsor, your co-sponsor if you have one, and any other members of your mentoring team are all going to have to submit a Biosketch. So you as a fellowship applicant are not going to have the same NIH standard Biosketch format as your mentor would. So you need to read the format instructions carefully because there are different things that are going to need to be included here. So you also need in your Biosketch to include a compelling personal statement narrative. And for a fellowship applicant, this is going to talk about some of your previous research experience and how that's shaped your current interests and skills, and all of the lessons that you've learned from this previous scientific experience, both technically and professionally. And then you need to also introduce how the training is going to help you further those goals and further those skills. You also can and should include details of your academic record here. That's something a lot of people don't remember to include, but for example, predoctoral candidates should include their GRE scores, and pre- and postdoctoral candidates should include their grades in relevant science coursework. Publications, obviously you're going to put your publications that have already been published and are out there in all of your presentations as well. But you should also include publications that, for example, have been submitted or that you're working on writing. Reviewers like to see that you're working on publishing your work. So some other sort of general tips for success with these fellowship applications. The sponsor needs to have sufficient funding to support the pre- or postdoctoral fellow, or that's going to count against you in review. Ruth has already mentioned this, but it is important to remember. It often seems counterintuitive to people because obviously you're looking to get funding, but you're just looking to get funding with a fellowship application for your own salary and your own tuition, not to buy research supplies and support a lab. So that's why they really want to see that your sponsor has sufficient funding to support you. Recommendations are a really important part of your fellowship application process as well. You're going to want to pick people that you trust and who know you really well. You're also going to want to pick people that you think are reliable to turn them in on time. That's a really sad reason for your fellowship application to not get reviewed favorably, but they need to be in on time and the forms need to be filled out completely. It's not actually just a letter. It's a letter and a form that has to be filled out where the recommender has to, for example, rank you compared to other people at a similar career stage in different skill areas. So make sure that the people you're picking for these recommendations are going to do all of that. Also, when you're picking people to be your recommenders, you want to pick people that not all of them are direct collaborators on the research project that you're proposing. Sometimes reviewers can see that as a little bit of a conflict of interest because those people would benefit from you getting this grant. It's great to also have, for example, you'll need your mentor during your PhD training to write one, or someone from earlier in your career stage, as well as some of your current collaborators. Obviously, that's going to vary by individual, but that's just something to keep in mind that reviewers might or might not consider. Research strategy is also only one part of the application. As we've mentioned, you don't want to neglect the other sections. There's lots of little sections, and it can be easy to sort of not pay much attention to some of the shorter ones, especially, but they're all important because they're all really contributing towards those 5 review criteria. You want to make sure that you're putting the time in to do a good job on all of them. Facilities and equipment are 2 sections that all you want to do here is make it clear that a lack of proper facilities and research equipment isn't going to impede your personal research and training plan. The point here isn't to list every piece of equipment that your institution has that could ever be used in any scientific project ever. You just want to be listing the things that are going to be useful for your project and make it clear to the reviewers you have what you need to be successful at your institution. Some other general tips for success, you definitely want to carefully fill out topics such as your training and responsible conduct of research, which is required for all of these fellowship applications, and how you're going to include children, women, and minorities in your research, or why that's not appropriate for the research that you're proposing. So definitely fill these out carefully. If your application gets flagged as not having filled these areas out appropriately, that could really delay your funding and hurt your application. It's another really good idea to ask your graduate program or postdoctoral office, or just ask people in your lab, your department, anyone you know at your institution for examples of successfully funded fellowship proposals that are similar to the one you're writing, so like other F31 examples if you're writing an F31. It can be really helpful to see what people do and how they were able to be successful. And also, if you do have questions about the application process for these early career grants, definitely don't be scared to politely get in touch with your program officer or other staff at the NIH. And just a personal story, my application when I applied for an F31 grant was sent to an inappropriate study section sort of by accident, and I got in touch. They were really helpful. They were like, that was a mistake, and they reassigned it to a new study section that was a much better fit. So I was really glad I got in touch. You're not always going to get that as a result, but it can't hurt to get in touch if you do have a legitimate question. Resubmission, there are definitely a lot of these early career grants that do have to be resubmitted, and don't be very discouraged, especially if your application was actually discussed at the study section. That's a good sign. And if most of the comments were positive, but there were just a few things that people had concerns about, that's a good sign. You know, you should definitely try to resubmit that application, but you need to really carefully respond to every item that's in the review. And you'll have to include a one-page introduction with your resubmission that explains the changes that you've made and your responses to the criticisms in the original review. You're also going to have to resubmit recommendation letters. They can't even just be the same recommendation letters over again. You have to submit all new forms. They can be the same recommenders, but they have to be updated recommendations. Also, if you've unsuccessfully submitted two versions, so you submitted once and then you resubmitted, that's all of the submissions you can do for that fellowship application. You can still apply, for example, for an F32 fellowship, but it needs to be a new application that has a new mentoring plan and a new plan for your research strategy. It really can't be the same thing with some minor changes, or it will be rejected and won't be reviewed. So finally, I just wanted to include a little bit more information and some links that might be helpful for the F31 and F32 awards. So I've linked to the funding announcements for the F31 awards, and I would definitely like to note that there are special F31 mechanisms to promote diversity in health-related research, so that's definitely a great thing to check out if that might apply to you. And I've also included a link to some tips from the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. So those are really helpful, not just for applying to that institute, but for applying to any NIH institute. I think those are helpful tips. F32 awards. I've again linked to some different facets of the funding announcement and then the tips. And then I've also linked to some information about payback obligations. One thing to keep in mind is that for a predoctoral award, you don't incur a payback obligation, but postdoctoral trainees do incur a payback obligation with their first year of support. And the second full year of training would pay back this first year of postdoctoral support under normal circumstances. But if that doesn't work out, then you're going to be obliged to still perform 12 months of qualified research or teaching activities as payback. And you would have to refund the government for your stipend if you weren't able to do that, barring really extraordinary circumstances. So it's important to be aware of this obligation before you submit one of these applications. Also, one final note, for the F31 and F32 mechanisms, you do have to either be a U.S. citizen or a non-citizen national, or you have to have been lawfully admitted for permanent residence. So that you need to consider that before you decide if these mechanisms are a good fit for you.
Great. So now, thanks, Laura. Now we're going to talk a little bit about K awards, and I'm specifically just going to talk about the K99 ROO Pathway to Independence Award. This award was established to facilitate the transition to independence, specifically for postdoctoral researchers from mentored positions to independent tenure track or equivalent faculty positions. That's really the purpose of this award. So this award is interesting in that it combines elements of both K and R research awards. And it provides up to 1 to 2 years of mentored support in the K99 phase. And then in the ROO phase, it provides up to 3 years of support contingent on securing that independent research position, specifically as faculty member, a tenured faculty member. In terms of eligibility, for this award, one of the benefits of it, as Laura mentioned, the other awards do require citizenship, but this award is open to non-citizens as well. So eligibility includes having a doctoral degree, PhD or MD, with no more than 4 years of postdoctoral research training. And in terms of the K portion, they provide 75% effort for that. And in the R portion, they also provide up to 75% effort as well. In the K phase, the total cost per year is up to $90,000, and then in the R phase, the total costs are up to $249,000. So this is a really great award to keep in mind, and it really helps to facilitate that transition from the postdoc to the faculty role. And they do have a pretty good success rate, especially compared to R01s. It's a 22% success rate overall. And the average age of a K99 recipient is 34, which is almost 10 years younger than the R average age. So it's good to keep in mind, especially in this early career phase. Okay, well now we would like to turn the questions over to you, and so please feel free.
Thank you, Ruth and Laura. The one question that has come through is asking you to speak a little bit about resources for international postdocs to apply for.
Okay, so for international postdocs, I think the best mechanism to focus on would definitely be that K99 ROO mechanism, because it does not require U.S. citizenship. So that's a good one to think about. The training must be at NIH or extramural institutions in the United States. It cannot be at foreign institutions, so that's the only thing to keep in mind for international students. But as long as the research is being done here in the U.S. At a U.S. institution, you're eligible to apply.
And this is Laura, just another note. A number of the grants from other institutions, for example, advocacy or fundraising groups relevant to different health topics, many of those postdoctoral grants are open to non-citizens. But it's for training at a U.S. institution usually, for most of the ones that I'm familiar with. But that's something you could definitely check out with that link that I put from the Fogarty International Center. They have a number of those listed.
Great, thank you. The next question is asking if you could describe some differences in applying for funding from private organizations versus federal funding.
I can answer that. So I had an experience with applying, both to NIH as well as to the Hartford Foundation. And one thing that was interesting with the foundation is that they were really very interested in my specific journey in my past experience, and they wanted the application to read much more like a narrative, a story of kind of where I've come from and where I'm going. And that was very different than an NIH grant, kind of what they were looking for in terms of the style of writing a grant. So that was one difference.
This is Laura. I think it's really going to depend on which institution's grant that you're applying for. Many of them, for example, the American Heart Association postdoctoral fellowships, I happen to know those are formatted really similarly to an NIH F32 grant. So a lot of the same sections are needed, but you're going to really have to check that out institution by institution. The requirements are always going to be slightly different.
Great.
Just to add to that too, for the AHA, the review criteria and process for it is also similar to NIH. So.
Can you explain more on what 75% effort means for the K99, and do postdocs obtain salary from the K99, and if so, how much?
Yes, I can speak to that. So that depends a little bit institution to institution. But I'll just speak for the National Institute of Nursing Research. They provide salary support of $50,000, and this is specifically in the K99 portion. It might be different in the K23 or the K22. You'll have to look at the specific mechanisms. But in the K-99, they provide $50,000 of salary support and then about $25,000 maybe to $30,000 of research support. And I think, so that's what that means. So when it's 75% effort, that means that 75% of your time needs to be committed and focused on doing this research project. And you may be able to do, additional work in that 25% time, which may include some modest teaching, some clinical work, something else. But you're really not supposed to be working on other research projects. Is that clear?
And does the new Biosketch format apply to the K-99 award application?
Yes, it does. It actually applies to all grants that are going in for NIH after May. So for the June deadline, the new Biosketch needs to be used, and not just for the candidate, but also for all of the mentees and co-mentors and consultants and anyone that's submitting the Biosketch. All of those have to be in the new format. So, and just on the topic of the Biosketch, the K Biosketch is definitely a little different than the F Biosketch. In that, by the time you're doing the K Biosketch, the expectation is that you're not including papers that are in progress. They really should just be papers that are published or in press.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? If so, if you could please submit them via the questions icon on your control panel. Oh, yes, people do. Do you need to submit a detailed budget?
Yes, I know for the, I'm not as familiar with all of the mechanisms, but I know for the F series you do need to submit a budget. However, it's not usually as complicated as it would be, for example, for an R1, because as said, for the F31 and F32, you're really getting funding just for your own, either your stipend as a predoctoral student or your salary as a postdoctoral student, tuition, which your school is going to know how much that's going to be, and there's also a limit on how much you can apply for in terms of tuition and stipend support. And then you have a small budget for example, travel to conferences, purchasing a new computer, that kind of thing. But there's a pretty standard budget layout that you can use for that. And that's something that staff at your institution should be able to help you with as well when you're submitting the grant.
And just to add to that, so for the K, for instance, the K-99 portion, you have about $25,000 of research support. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you're writing the aims for your K, and not to, propose to do studies that would be more expensive than that, because the reviewers will be well acquainted with how much it costs to do a study, and that could definitely be an area that they would be highly critical of if you're kind of overestimating what you can do with $25,000. So it is very important to keep that budget in mind as you're writing.
Great. Could you explain what the differences are between the T32 and F31, F32 grants?
Sure. T32s are institutional grants, and so they are given to a PI at an institution for training. So T32s often support, let's say 3 predoctoral students and 2 postdoctoral students. The purpose of them is to, support students in their training, whereas F awards and K awards are person-specific. So a specific PI or a specific student or postdoc will write an award, and they personally receive the award rather than it being an institution or a school-specific award.
And just one other note on the T32 mechanisms and other institutional training mechanisms. For example, at the predoctoral level, you can only get 5 years of combined NIH support. So if you've already been supported on an institutional NIH training grant for several years, you're going to need to take that into account when you're deciding how many years of like F31 funding to be applying for. So keep those regulations in mind because there is often a limit on how long you can be on these different NIH supported mechanisms combined.
Great, thank you. The next question is, since it takes such a long time to complete the process to apply for a grant and receive feedback, does it make sense to apply to multiple grants at the same time?
That's a really great question. That's a really a million-dollar question. So I think that is something that you have to be careful about putting the exact same grant in to different institutions. But there are different ways of potentially dividing out some of the smaller pieces for maybe internal grant funding to have pilot funding from your university or your CTSA, or smaller amounts to supplement what would be the larger grant. But I would speak to your mentor about that and to your grants office because they can help you. They can help you with that.
For the F31, F32 grants, can mentors come from institutions other than your home institution?
I think they're generally going to prefer that you're having a lot of face-to-face time with your mentors. I don't know exactly what the regulations are on that. That's definitely the kind of question you could ask a program officer. But I would just say it's definitely going to count against you if your primary mentor, you're not going to be able to see them face-to-face very frequently. Now, sometimes if the two institutions are right in the same town or something, that might not be a huge hurdle. But especially at the predoctoral level, they really want you to be seeing your sponsor on a very frequent basis. So that's something to keep in mind with that situation. And I would definitely get in touch with the program officer about that question.
Yeah, and just to add to that, at the predoctoral level, they really expect, and specifically in your mentoring plan, that you are meeting face-to-face with that mentor weekly. So even if that's not exactly the reality, but they really, that's what the expectation is. And so that would really imply that that person was at your institution. For my F31, I had a consultant who was very closely part of my study, but at another institution, and that was looked at very favorably.
And just a note on the consultants, that's definitely something for F31 and F32s that consultants aren't, it's not the same thing as your sponsor or co-sponsor, but you can have multiple consultants that are going to be helping you with the project, both at your own or other institutions. And getting letters of support from those people and including them in your application package, that's not really a specific section you have to do, but if you are including those other people in your mentoring team or as a consultant, it's good to have a letter of support from them.
Great, thanks so much, Ruth and Laura. And I think we have one more question, and this will be the last question before we wrap things up. Does ESPO provide other grant writing resources or training for its members? Who can I contact if I have ideas about what resources might be helpful?
You know what, I might actually turn that over to Joanna, if Joanna may know a little bit more about the ESPO specific resources.
Thanks for that question. You know, I'd actually have to check with our ESPO council to see what they have to offer. But if anyone is interested, they can always email ESPO at espo@jaron.org with a specific question, and we can get back to you with potential resources that we have at ESPO.
Thank you. Joanna, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. So on behalf of the ESPO Webinar Task Force, I'd like to thank our speakers again for their excellent presentation, and I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and participation. This webinar has been recorded, and it and the slides will be available on the GSA website in geron.org under ESPO Resources shortly. The slides and the webinar will also be available on GSA Connect. For audience members, upon leaving a webinar, you'll be sent a survey for this and future webinars. So please take the time to provide information on how we can tailor future webinars to your needs as ESPO members. Once again, thank you and have a great day.